this is David Pike, the MotorCity mechanic. Now this video is part 2 on the series for removing and replacing the lifters and rocker arms on a Chrysler 3.2 and 3.6 liter Pentastar engine. At this point we're getting ready to take the timing cover off so I can show you everything that's hidden behind here. Remember, you don't have to take it off. I'm only doing this so I can show you all the internal things that we're going to be dealing with. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Now this right here is the left side timing chain tensioner. It's hydraulically controlled. If you look right here, you can actually see the L stamped into it. Now this one's about 2 to 3 inches below the deck where the valve cover sits. This one you can get access to. And it takes 2 special tools to relieve the tension. Now the way it works is we've got hydraulic pressure coming from the back side here, which is oil. It's pushing on a piston, which pushes on this guide that takes up all the slack in the chain. Now there's a ratcheting mechanism that extends with that piston. And what happens is if you lose any kind of oil pressure in here, and even if that piston moves back slightly, the ratcheting portion will prevent it from going further back inside the bore, which would cause too much slack, could cause valve to piston contact. So we've got to use some special tools for releasing that mechanism. Right side doesn't have this setup, left side does, but again, luckily you can access this with the valve cover off, even with the cover in place, and we're using a special tool just for that. Now in order to get the slack on this chain and get that piston back into its bore, we've got to release the ratcheting mechanism. Now with that special tool, you can get between the timing cover and the cylinder head, and you go along the front of that hydraulic tensioner till you get to this larger hole. Once in, you want to kind of pull back towards the cylinder head, and then you're going to lift up. At the same time, we're going to insert a wedge. The wedge is going to push on this guide, and it's going to allow that piston to go in, and we're going to leave the wedge in place. So this is what you got right here. You've got that cover that's blocking that, but you still got enough room to get in there. If you look with a flashlight, you can see that larger hole. So that's how we release that tensioner. Now that was the tool for releasing the ratcheting mechanism. The next thing we need is this wedge right here. Now the tool part number is 10200A-1. This is for all the years. Again, the right side, there's a difference from year to year. Nonetheless, this is the left side wedge. And the way it gets used is we insert it down into this area between the camshaft and the cylinder head. And part of it wedges itself up against the guide, and the other one against this aluminum portion right here, this coolant passage on the cylinder head. So as we release that ratcheting mechanism, we're now sliding the wedge down in here, which pushes everything in place. Now we're going to keep it there so that we can take everything loose. So grab the special tool, work it down in there, get it into the tensioner, pick up on the ratcheting mechanism. Then grab your wedge, put it between the camshaft and the guide, and push down. And once you've got that wedge fully seated, you'll see that it moves the guide out of the way. Leave the wedge in place and take that little metal tool we use for the tensioner and remove it. Now we need to verify that the tensioner has been released and that the wedge is doing its job. And we do that by grabbing the chain. Usually you can grab right here and see you've got play in it. That's the slack we're looking for. Now you may have to rotate the camshaft slightly to get that slack. But again, once we see that, everything's released, we're ready to move on to the oil control valve. Now when we do this repair, I recommend doing one camshaft at a time. Don't take everything off. One at a time, reinstall, move over to the next one. Now I'm only going to show you one camshaft being removed. The procedure is exactly the same for the other one. Now the oil control valve we took loose before, so it's only finger tight, and what we're going to do is start backing it out. Now a warning I want to give you is if you're ever taking off the oil control valve, or for whatever reason the cam phaser, for example if you're replacing the cylinder head, do not put these in a magnetic parts tray. I know for sure it will damage the cam phaser. I'm not sure about the oil control valve, but again, I'd rather you err on the side of caution than to have that problem, and then you go back, reinstall everything, test drive, find out what happened, and then have to tear everything back apart to replace it. Now if that wedge is still installed and the tension released on the chain, I can actually grab that cam phaser. I can wiggle it and get it loose, and I can pull it forward enough to clear the camshaft. Again, I didn't have to take the cam phaser off the chain. It's still in place. We're just using that block to kind of support everything, and it has deep enough grooves to where I can actually pull back on it. So now we can actually work on removing the cam bearing cap bolts. Now if you remember earlier, I had you put some paint marks on the cam bearing caps. And that was in reference to the dots that were machined into the end of the camshaft and the cam phaser. And the reason was we're going to be rotating this about 30 degrees. to what we call the rest position of the camshaft. Because right now certain cam lobes are pushing down on the valve spring, so there is some tension. When we rotate it at 30 degrees, at that point nothing's really got any pressure on it, so it's a lot easier to take the fasteners loose and we're not putting any unneeded stress on it. So now that we've got it taken loose from the cam phaser, we've got these nice little areas right here that we can put a crescent wrench on, and we're going to rotate it. That right there is the rest area. You can actually feel it, and you can see all that slack we got. Typically you don't want to rotate the camshaft independent of the crank, but in this case this is per the service information and it's going to help with removal. With the tension released, we can actually start taking the fasteners loose on the cam bearing caps. These are a T30 Torx. I don't recommend using any kind of air tools because if you know anything about a Torx, they can round off easily. So just grab you a hand tool and start breaking them loose. Don't worry if you remove these and get them out of position. There are some identification marks and some other items I want to point out that actually tell you where they go and in what direction. Now if you look closely to the cam bearing caps, there's one thing that stands out right away. We've got these notches cut in. Those notches actually designate forward. So when you're reinstalling them, they don't go like this, notches towards the front. Another thing is, on the back side right here, we've got markings. This has a 2i and an arrow as well. Arrow faces the front. 2 meaning position. We've got 1, 2, 3 on down the line. I meaning intake. So that way you don't get it mixed up with the exhaust. But again, we're only doing one at a time. But if for some reason you had the cylinder head off and you threw all these into a pile, you could still tell where they went. It's all marked on there. Now if all the cam bearing caps are moved, all we gotta do is pick up on the camshaft and set it to the side. So while we've got the camshaft out, I want you to pay attention to some markings that are on here. Just like those cam bearing caps. They've done something so that way if you pay attention you won't install either the wrong cam or in the wrong position. Yes, we're only doing one at a time, but if you're replacing this camshaft, who knows if you've been given the correct one. So if you read further down here, we've got some raised letters, and I actually added some paint to it so you could see. It tells you what engine. This is a 3.6, not a 3.2, so it's correct. And also the next lettering down below is really important. That's going to tell us what side of the engine and if it's intake or exhaust. L means for left, R for right, I for intake, E for exhaust. So this is LI, meaning left intake. So again, if you're installing a head, you've got these camshafts laying around, pay attention. If you're replacing one, make sure you've got the correct part. Just a little something to point out. Now, if the camshaft removed, we need to do a thorough inspection of each one of the cam lobes. We're going to be looking for any kind of damage related to a failed rocker arm. Some damage is okay, while others is excessive and replacement of the camshaft is needed. This lobe right here, this is typical of what I find with a failed rocker arm that was caught in time. We do have some damage to the outside edges of the lobe, but this center portion that the roller rocker rides on is still intact. It's nice and shiny, looks polished. Now what you could do to verify is measure the lobe here compared to the one next to it. If the numbers are the same, reuse this. Now this one right here is a worst case scenario. Look at this cam lobe. This has been driven for a period of time with a roller that's seized up on the rocker. We've got 2 raised areas. This is going to have to be replaced. The one next to it doesn't have the damage to the outside edge, doesn't have the raised areas, but the tip of the lobe is worn excessive. It's not nice and shiny. You've got some unusual wear patterns. This cam gets replaced, and in my opinion, that one can get reused. Now, with the camshaft removed, we've now got access to the rocker arms, and directly below each one is the lifter. All you gotta do is pick it up. With the lifter, you can usually grab them by hand, or you can grab a tool like a pair of needle nose pliers and pull them out of the bore. Now, this is what a bad rocker arm is going to look like. You can grab the body of it with one hand, and the other 2 fingers on the opposite hand, grab that roller and see if there's movement. We've got needle bearings that have failed that allows the roller to move on the shaft. That can cause a noise and cause a misfire. So that's definitely a bad one. It's not a bad idea to just go ahead and check them while you tear them apart just to find them, just to kind of verify that you did diagnose it properly. But nonetheless, we're going to be replacing all of them on this side to begin with. So now that we've got that camshaft and the rocker arms and lifters removed on the left side, let's jump back over to the right side. I want to show you how to release the tension on this chain. Now, with the timing chain cover removed, you can clearly see the right side timing chain tensioner. Just like the left side having an L, this one has an R. This one is positioned further down into the cover, closer to where the crankshaft is. So you cannot access this with the cover in place, but you don't really need to, because the big difference between the right and the left side is this one doesn't have that ratcheting mechanism. So there is no hole that you need to insert a special tool. Instead, we're only going to be using one of the wedges, and it's going to push against this timing chain guide. That's going to push the piston back into the bore of the tensioner itself, and the wedge will keep it there. Now, before we release the tension on the right side timing chain, we need to kind of follow some of the same procedures that I showed you on the left side. Mainly locking the cam phasers or gears together using that special tool. Remember, there's a right side, left side. Make sure you grab the appropriate one. Writing goes up. Try to insert it between the two. We've already got the timing marks lined up, but if it still doesn't slide in, grab your crescent wrench, go on one of the cams, and move it until it does. Now, the other things we need to do that we did to the left side are, we need to put some paint marks on both the links and the marks on the cam sprockets. Do the same thing for the cam bearing caps. Once we do that, we're going to go ahead and also break these oil control valves loose. Remember, don't take them all the way off, just break them loose to where you can take them off by hand. So let me show you the wedge or wedges that we use for the right side. Now, the reason why we have two different wedges for the right side is because there was a design change after 2011. Everything else in the kit is the same except for the right side. If you look at the bottom of the tool in my left hand, you'll see that the base is a lot wider when compared to the one in my right hand. The one on the left is for 2011 only. The part number on this tool is 102-008-2. Again, this is for only one model year, 2011. One in my right hand, 2012 and beyond, we got a part number for the tool, 10369A. This is the one we're going to be using because this is a 2013. Now, when we inserted the special tool on the left side, we went between the intake cam and the cylinder head. Right side's different. We're going between the intake cam and exhaust cam. And also, there's a correct position for the tool. On the back side here, you'll see this deep groove. That goes towards the cylinder head. Matter of fact, there is a head of a bolt that's going to ride in that groove. Now, you're coming in at a sharp angle. You kind of insert it down like this. And as you go down, you're going to be guiding the tool over this 13mm bolt right here. It's going to slide inside that track, and it's going to work its way down in between this portion of the timing cover and the timing chain guide. And as you keep pushing, it's going to work its way down in there till it's fully seated. At that point, we can grab the chain and make sure that we've got the tension released. Now, the issue that you can run into is, as you're installing that special tool, it has to ride on the outer edge of the guide up against the cylinder head. And it has a tendency, as you're pressing it down, to pop off. And the reason for that is, the guide right here slides onto a pin. It's not bolted on or anything, it slides onto a pin. Down here we've got the hydraulic tensioner, and in the center is where we're actually applying the force to kind of push it down. Being that it slides on, it has the ability to move. So what we want to do is, with the timing cover installed, you can put a trim stick down in here, or you can use a small pry bar, something to kind of wedge between the guide and the timing chain cover. When you do, it kind of presses the guide up against the cylinder head, and you have a better chance of the special tool staying on the edge of the guide. Remember, I had you put marks on the cam bearing caps because we were going to rotate the camshafts 30 degrees towards the center? Well, that's not the case at the right side. You do not have to rotate these. They're already in the rest position, or as close to rest position as possible. So at that point, you can just go ahead and start taking the cam bearing cap bolts off and just lift the cam up. There is no rotating it, so you don't have to be too worried about that. And that's how we release the tension on the left side and the right side. Again, we're not going to take the right side loose because it's exactly the same as doing the left side. I just really wanted to show you how these tensioners operate, the special tools you got to use, and again, the timing cover was removed just to be able to show you how everything works. You don't have to take it off when you're doing this. So now that we've got all this shown, we'll jump back over to the left side. Now, before I go installing my new rockers and lifters, what I like to do is pre-lube them. So I grab them, insert into a container, and then I'm going to pour some whatever weight oil that engine takes in there. In this case, 5W20. I'm going to let it soak for a little while. And as it does, you'll actually see that we've got some air bubbles coming out. Now, I'm going to let them sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to grab a screwdriver every so often and kind of move them around. Now, this isn't a do or die thing. It's just something I like to do. It kind of prevents a lot of noise on startup. So everything's pre-lubed. We don't have to worry about anything having to be primed or filled up with oil as the engine's running for a little bit of period of time. We're kind of already there. So again, let it sit for about 10-15 minutes. We'll pour it out. We'll install these into the engine. And if we're doing another cam, we'll go ahead and pre-soak those while we're doing that. Now, installing the lifters in the rocker arm is nothing difficult. You slide the lifters down into the bores. When you do your rocker arms, there is a curved portion and a box side. The box side goes to the valve stem, curved to the top of the lifter. Make sure they're fully seated, and just keep on going on down the line. And now we're ready to install the camshaft. Now, do you need to lube the cam before installing? Technically, if you're reusing the old cam, you usually see that there's still some oil in the cam bearing areas. Also, the camshaft hasn't been cleaned off, so there's probably oil residue. Typically, you don't need to, but I kind of treat it like I would a brand new cam. I get some assembly lube, wipe it on there, because there's no harm in doing this. If for some reason you do put it on dry, you could damage the bearing surfaces, so why not just go ahead if you've got some on hand. Now, before we drop it back into the cylinder head, we need to make sure that the rocker arms are still in position, they didn't fall out or get moved. And again, pay attention to the two alignment holes. We're not going perpendicular right now, because if you remember, we had to rotate the left cam about 30 degrees. Right cam, we didn't have to do anything. Left cam, we do. We're just going to sit it down in there. And you'll know if it's in the correct position because it'll sit flush and you'll have that little bit of wiggle right there. Now we're ready for the cam bearing caps. Yeah, just grab you one of the cam bearing caps. Remember, notches go towards front. Pay attention to the markings. This is position 1, 2, 3, and 4. So just make sure you put it in the correct location. And we're just going to run them down by hand. Now, the T30 torque bolts that hold the cam bearing caps down need to be tightened down in a specific sequence, and there is a certain torque as far as how tight. This is the left side head, timing chains over here. All we're basically doing is we're jumping from the second cam bearing cap to the fourth one, down to the third, and finally finishing up with the first. And we typically start from the inside fastener and work our way out. For example, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's the intake cam. Exhaust cam. Again, we start on the inside. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now the spec for this is 89 inch-pounds. 89 inch-pounds on these T30 torques. Now that's the left side. Let me show you how the right side is, and it's not much different. And this right here is the right side. We've got the front over here where the timing chain is. Back corner over here is where that PCV valve goes. Again, same basic idea. Jump from the second to the fourth, the third, back to the first. Starting from the inside. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Same thing, exhaust valve. Start from the center. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, 89 inch-pounds. So now that we know the sequence, all we got to do is grab our torque wrench, start tightening up all the cam bearing caps that we took off previously. So the cam bearing cap bolts have been torqued to specs and in the proper sequence. We're ready to go ahead and rotate that camshaft back to where the holes are straight up. Remember, that paint mark here is going to apply to a dot that's actually machined into the camshaft. Use your crescent wrench and start rotating it. Now it's under spring tension. It may take some effort. Get it as close as you can. At that point, we're ready to start wiggling on the cam phaser or the cam sprocket to try to line it back up. And once we do, we'll insert that oil control valve back to the center. And once we've got the oil control valve snugged by hand, there's no reason why we still need the wedge right here for the timing chain tensioner. We're going to leave the block in place because we actually got to torque this down. At this point, we can go ahead and remove this. Now the oil control valves are tightened down to a specific torque, and that is 118 foot-pounds. Again, 118 foot-pounds on the oil control valve. Just repeat it on the other one, just to be sure. At that point, we're ready to go ahead and pull out that wedge or block. And now we're ready to go ahead and seal everything off by reinstalling the valve covers that we removed. Now, if you remember in the beginning, we had to pry them up gently because, as I mentioned, there is RTV that's actually between the timing cover and the cylinder head. We need to shove something down in the cover right here, get a plastic scraper, and remove the excess buildup of the dry RTV. Once that's clean, we're going to smear a nice new uniform bead in those two spots. Next thing is we're going to be removing and replacing the valve cover gasket. That's pretty cut and dry. Main thing you need to pay attention to is the spark plug tube seals. They tell you to inspect them. It's not necessary to always replace them, but if you got around 100,000 miles, it's best to go ahead and knock them out. They're not that easy to remove and install, but again, once you reach that interval, it's probably a good practice. Now, as we go back down, we're going to torque all the bolts in a certain sequence. I'm going to show you this diagram right here. You can stop the video and look at it at your leisure, but nonetheless, it gives you the pattern in which you need to follow for tightening down those fasteners. Now, the spec for the valve cover bolts is 106 inch-pounds. 106 inch-pounds. Now, once we got those installed, we're going to move back over to the electronic actuators that were removed on the front. Now, there is no spec giving on these as far as how tight we need to get them. Just snug them down. Now, last thing is that PCV valve. Now, the problem with the PCV valve is, based on what vehicle you're in, it's almost impossible to torque those fasteners. But we do have a torque spec for that. Now, if you've got enough room to access those T25 torque bolts for the PCV valve, then the spec on that is going to be 35 inch-pounds. 35 inch-pounds on the PCV valve. Now, even though I didn't show you how to remove the upper intake because it's different for every vehicle that this engine is in, I'm going to show you about the reinstallation as far as the specs and the sequence for tightening down the fasteners. But before we do that, we need to remove and replace these upper intake seals. Now that all 6 of the seals have been replaced, we're ready to grab the upper intake. We're just going to gently sit it down on the lower and line things up. I'm going to show you a diagram, and that diagram is going to have the sequence for all the fasteners down the middle of this intake, attaching it to the lower. Now, the spec for this is 89 inch-pounds. 89 inch-pounds for the upper intake to the lower intake. And that brings us to the end of the series on removing and replacing the rocker arms and lifters. Now, there's a lot of information I packed into both of these episodes, so I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. The job's not that bad if you take your time and you get the special tools, and if you follow the information I gave you, you shouldn't have any issues. But if you do, hopefully there's some information buried into both of these videos that will show you what you need to know. Now, if you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up on YouTube. Don't forget you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you got any comments or suggestions about anything you saw in these 2 episodes, please leave something in the comments below, or you can email me at david@motorcitymechanic.com. If this is the first time you've seen one of my videos, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you get notified each and every time a new video gets uploaded. Last but not least, if you shop on Amazon, which everybody does, scroll down into the description below. There's a link. Click on that link, make that your Amazon homepage, and anytime you buy something, you will be helping to support this channel. Once again, everybody, thanks for watching all these videos.